In the crowded, noisy hallways of Northwood High, she moved like a whisper in a hurricane. To most people, she was just a background character, a girl they might have seen in a few classes but whose name they could never quite remember. Her notebooks were always neat, her homework always turned in on time, but she never raised her hand, never joined a conversation, and never sat with anyone at lunch. She was a master of being invisible, a skill she had perfected over years of practice. Her world was a carefully constructed bubble of silence, and she liked it that way. It was safe. The school day was a series of obstacles to be navigated, a performance of quiet conformity. In her physics class, while other students chattered and passed notes, she would sit perfectly still, her focus entirely on the equations scrawled on the whiteboard. She understood the logic of physics, the clean, predictable rules that governed the universe. It was a comfort, unlike the chaotic and unpredictable world of teenage social politics. During group projects, she would inevitably do most of the work, not because she was a pushover, but because it was easier than trying to negotiate with her peers. She would complete her part, slide it across the table to her group members with a mumbled, "Here you go," and retreat back into her shell. They would get a good grade, and she would get to remain unnoticed. It was a trade she was willing to make. Lunchtime was the worst. The cafeteria was a jungle of noise and smells, a place where social hierarchies were on full display. She would quickly grab a tray, usually just a carton of milk and an apple, and find the most isolated corner she could. She would sit with her back to the wall, pulling a worn paperback from her bag. The book was her shield, a portal to another world where she didn't have to be the quiet girl from Northwood High. She could feel the occasional curious glance, but she never looked up. She had learned that making eye contact was an invitation, and she had no interest in accepting any. She would eat her apple slowly, turn the pages of her book, and wait for the bell to ring, signaling her escape. The walk home was her daily transition. As she left the school grounds behind, a subtle change would begin. The tense set of her shoulders would start to relax. Her pace, which was always brisk and purposeful at school, would slow to a meander. She would take a different route each day, wandering through the quiet, tree-lined streets of her neighborhood. She would notice the small things, the way the afternoon light filtered through the leaves, the color of a neighbor's newly planted flowers, the sound of a distant lawnmower. This was her time to decompress, to shed the invisible cloak she wore all day and slowly become herself. Her house was always empty when she arrived. Her parents worked long hours, a fact that she used to resent but now saw as a blessing. It meant she had the place to herself. She would drop her bag by the door, kick off her sneakers, and head straight for the living room. And there it was, her grandmother's old, upright piano. It wasn't a fancy instrument. The wood was scratched and chipped in places, and some of the ivory keys were yellowed with age. But to her, it was the most beautiful object in the world. It was more than just a piano. It was a living thing, a keeper of secrets, a portal to a world where she could be anyone she wanted to be. She would run her fingers lightly over the keys, a familiar and comforting gesture. She didn't need sheet music. The music lived inside her, a river of melodies and harmonies that had been building up all day. As she sat down on the worn wooden bench, the transformation was complete. The quiet, invisible girl from the school hallway was gone. In her place was a musician, an artist, a storyteller. Her hands, which had been clenched in her pockets all day, would begin to move. At first, the notes were soft and hesitant, like a question. But then, as the confidence flowed back into her, the music would swell. It was a language only she understood, a way of expressing all the things she could never say out loud. The frustration of a boring lecture would become a flurry of angry, staccato chords. The joy of a beautiful sunset would be a light, cascading melody. The loneliness she felt at lunch would transform into a haunting, melancholic tune that filled the empty house. She would lose all track of time, completely absorbed in the world she was creating with her hands. Her eyes would close, her head would tilt back, and a small, genuine smile would play on her lips. This was where she was truly herself. Not the quiet observer, but the creator. Not the background character, but the main character of her own story. The piano was her voice, and it had a lot to say. She would play until her fingers ached and the last rays of sunlight disappeared from the window. And then, as the evening quiet settled in, she would close the lid gently, like saying goodnight to an old friend. The music would be tucked away inside her again, waiting for tomorrow, waiting for the next time she could return to her secret world and be free. She knew she could never share this part of herself with anyone at school. It was too precious, too real. The thought of her classmates, with their easy laughter and casual judgments, hearing her music was unbearable. So, she would keep her secret, and the next day, she would go back to being the ghost in the hallway, the quiet observer, the girl no one really saw. And she was content with that because she knew that when the final bell rang, she had a world of her own to go back to, a world where she was anything but quiet. The music room was a different kind of noisy than the rest of the school. It wasn't the chaotic shouting and slamming of lockers, but a messy, disorganized noise of failed attempts. A boy in the corner tooted a sad, wheezing note on a trumpet. A couple of girls were giggling as they plucked at the strings of a cello, making it sound like a dying cat. The air smelled like old wood, floor wax, and the faint, dusty scent of sheet music that had been sitting in cabinets for decades. She was there for her sociology project, observing group dynamics in a non-academic setting. It was the perfect excuse to be in a place where she didn't belong, to watch without being expected to participate. She sat in a chair against the back wall, her notebook open on her lap, but she wasn't taking many notes. She was just absorbing Dot at the front of the room. The teacher was losing his battle. He was a man with a wild mop of graying hair and a tie that was never quite straight. He had a kind of frantic energy, like he was running out of time to teach his students everything he knew about the magic of music. He would pace back and forth, his arms waving as he tried to explain the concept of crescendo, not just as a symbol on a page, but as a feeling, a building of emotion that should start in your toes and explode out your fingertips. The students, however, were not feeling it. They slouched in their seats, some doodling in their textbooks, others staring blankly out the window, their bodies present but their minds miles away. He was trying to give them fire, and all they were offering him was a puddle of lukewarm water. "Look, it's not just about playing the right notes," he said, his voice rising with frustration. He slapped a hand down on the grand piano, creating a startling, discordant crash that made a few students jump. "Anyone can learn to press a key. A machine can do that. Music is about what happens between the notes. It's about the silence, the tension, the release. It's about telling a story without saying a single word." He looked out at the sea of bored faces and let out a long, dramatic sigh. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, making it stand on end. "You think talent is loud? You think it's the person who volunteers first, the one who isn't afraid to be heard. But you're wrong." He stopped pacing and stood very still, his eyes scanning the room, looking for a victim, an example. The girl in the back shrank lower in her chair, pulling her notebook up slightly as if it were a shield. She prayed for him to pick one of the trumpet players or one of the giggling cello girls. Anyone but her. She was just an observer. She wasn't part of this. "Sometimes," the teacher continued, his voice dropping to a more dramatic, conspiratorial tone, "the most profound music comes from the unlikeliest of places. It comes from a place of quiet, from someone who is listening so hard to the world that the music just starts to spill out of them." His gaze swept past the familiar faces of his students, the ones he knew by name and by the sound of their mediocre playing, and then it landed on her, the quiet stranger in the back. The perfect blank canvas for his lesson, his eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, the noisy room, the dusty smell, the slouching students, it all faded away. It was just the two of them. A jolt of pure, ice-cold panic shot through her. "You," he said, his voice clear and sharp, cutting through the fog of her fear. He pointed a finger directly at her. "Yes, you. The young lady in the back. Come up here." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Every head turned. 30 pairs of eyes were suddenly on her. She could feel their collective gaze like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her mind went completely blank. The sociology project, her notebook, the reason she was even in this room, it all evaporated. There was only the teacher's pointing finger and the horrifying, impossible command. Her first instinct was to shake her head, to mouth the word no, but her body was frozen. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. "Come on, don't be shy," he said, his tone encouraging but firm. He had no idea he was asking her to walk a tightrope over a pit of fire. He thought he was just making a point. "Let's see what you've got. Show the class what real feeling sounds like." Someone near the front snickered. The sound was like a tiny needle prick, popping the bubble of her anonymity. With legs that felt like they were made of cement, she pushed her chair back. The scrape of its legs against the floor was unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent room. She stood up, her notebook slipping from her lap and falling to the floor with a soft thud. She didn't even bend to pick it up. She just started walking. The journey from the back wall to the grand piano at the front of the room was the longest walk of her life. Each step was a negotiation with gravity. She could feel the eyes of her classmates boring into her back. She imagined what they were thinking. Asterisk, who is she? Why her? She looks like she's about to be sick. Asterisk, she kept her eyes fixed on the piano, on its glossy black surface that reflected the fluorescent lights of the classroom like a frozen lake. It wasn't her grandmother's warm, familiar upright. This was a monster. A big, black, gleaming monster with hundreds of teeth. Waiting to bite Dot as she walked past the front row of students, she caught a glimpse of their faces. Some looked pitying. Others looked amused, enjoying the show. A few just looked bored, waiting for this awkward interruption to be over so they could go back to not caring about music. The teacher stood to the side, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of intense expectation on his face. He had chosen his champion for the day, and he was waiting for her to perform a miracle. Finally, she reached the piano. The polished wood was cool and smooth under her trembling fingers. She hesitated for a moment before slowly lowering herself onto the cold leather bench. It creaked softly, the sound echoing in the profound silence of the room. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists in her lap just to stop them. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the keys. They were so white, so perfect, so intimidating. They looked nothing like the yellowed, slightly chipped keys she knew so well. These keys belonged to someone else, to a world of confident performers and skilled musicians. They didn't belong to a quiet girl who played secrets in an empty living room. The teacher leaned in slightly, his shadow falling over her. "Anything at all," he said, his voice a low murmur. He was giving her an opening, a chance to back down, to play a simple chopsticks and get it over with. But she couldn't even do that. Her mind was a wall of white noise. There were no notes, no melodies, no memories of the beautiful music she played every day. There was only the suffocating pressure of the room, the weight of 30 stairs, and the terrifying, silent black and white monster in front of her. The silence in the music room was a heavy, living thing. It pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She sat on the cold leather bench, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap, her knuckles white. The grand piano in front of her seemed to grow larger, its black lacquer surface swallowing the light from the ceiling fixtures. It wasn't an instrument. It was a stage, and she was a fraud about to be exposed. The teacher stood a few feet away, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. He was waiting. The whole class was waiting. 30 pairs of eyes felt like 30 tiny spotlights, all aimed directly at her. Burning her skin, her mind was a frantic, scrambled mess. Thoughts crashed into each other like waves in a storm. "Just stand up and walk out," one voice screamed. Asterisk, "Tell him you can't." "Tell him you're sick." Another voice, quieter but more insistent, whispered, "You'll regret this forever. You'll always be the girl who ran away." Asterisk, she could feel a hot, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. A bead of sweat trickled down her spine. She imagined the boy in the corner with the trumpet smirking, the girls with the cello whispering to each other, pointing. They were a jury, and she had already been found guilty of the crime of being different, of being put on the spot. She tried to remember a song, any song. A simple nursery rhyme, a pop tune she'd heard on the radio. But her mind was a blank wall. There was nothing there. The music she loved so much, the melodies that filled her every afternoon, was locked away in a deep, dark vault inside her, and she had lost the key. All she could access was the fear. It was a roaring in her ears, drowning out everything else. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might leap right out of her chest. She was sure everyone in the room could hear it, a frantic, pathetic drumbeat of pure panic. Slowly, hesitantly, she unclenched her fists and lifted her hands. They were trembling violently, like leaves in a high wind. She held them over the keys, but she couldn't bring them to touch the ivory. Her fingers felt like foreign objects, disconnected from her body, useless and clumsy. She saw a reflection of herself in the polished wood of the piano, a small, hunched figure with wide, terrified eyes. She didn't recognize this person. This wasn't the girl who played with such passion and freedom in her living room. That girl was gone, replaced by this shaking, silent statue. The teacher shifted his weight. The soft scuff of his shoe on the floor was like a gunshot in the silence. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentler now, perhaps sensing her complete and utter terror. "Just a few notes. Whatever comes to mind." His kindness was almost worse than his impatience. It felt like pity, and she hated it. She didn't want his pity. She wanted to disappear. And then something shifted. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible change. A thought surfaced from the depths of her panic. This isn't my piano. This grand, gleaming monster was not her friend. It was cold and unfamiliar. Her piano was warm. It had scratches and dents. It had history. It had a little chip on the C-sharp key that her fingernail always caught on. This thought was a small anchor in the raging sea of her fear. She closed her eyes. It was a simple act, but it changed everything. The moment her eyelids fluttered shut, the room vanished. The staring students, the waiting teacher, the intimidating black piano, they all disappeared. The pressure on her shoulders eased. The roaring in her ears quieted to a dull hum. She was no longer in the music room at Northwood High. She was just a girl sitting at a piano. She focused on her breathing, just like she did at home when a difficult piece of music frustrated her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A slow, deep breath. Then another. With each exhale, she felt a tiny bit of the tension leave her body. Her hands, which had been hovering stiffly over the keys, began to lower. Her trembling subsided, just a little. Her fingers, now only slightly shaking, finally made contact with the ivory. It was cool and smooth. Not warm and worn like her piano, but it was still a piano. The familiar feel of the keys under her fingertips was a jolt of recognition. It was like hearing a language she thought she had forgotten. Her right hand found its natural position, her thumb resting on middle C. It was a muscle memory, so deeply ingrained that it bypassed her conscious thought entirely. Her fingers knew what to do, even if her mind was still trying to catch up. She kept her eyes closed. She pictured her living room at home. She pictured the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She could almost smell the faint scent of old wood and lemon polish. She was safe there. In her mind, she was not on a stage. She was home. Her thumb pressed down on the middle C key. A single, clear note filled the silent room. It was not loud or dramatic. It was just a note. But to her, it was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the first word spoken after a long silence. It was a crack in the wall of her fear. The note hung in the air for a moment, pure and perfect, before fading away. No one laughed. No one moved. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't a heavy, waiting silence. It was a listening silence. She took another deep breath. Her left hand, which had been resting in her lap, moved to the keyboard. Her fingers, guided by a memory that was now slowly awakening, found a simple chord. She played it, a soft, gentle harmony that followed the single note she had just played. It was the beginning of a melody she knew by heart, a simple, sad little tune she had figured out herself one rainy afternoon. It wasn't a complicated piece from a famous composer. It was her music. As she played the first few bars, something incredible happened. The world outside her mind, The world of the classroom began to fade away completely. The music was a shield, a protective bubble forming around her. The voices in her head telling her she couldn't do it were replaced by the sound of the notes she was creating. Her focus narrowed until there was nothing left in the universe but her and the piano. Her fingers, which had been so clumsy and unsure just moments before, began to move with a newfound confidence. They remembered the way. The simple melody began to flow, not perfectly, but with a growing sense of purpose. She was no longer thinking about what the class or the teacher thought. She was just playing. And for the first time since she had walked into the room, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. She felt a tiny spark of the joy she found in her secret world, and it was beginning to catch fire. The simple, sad melody flowed from her fingers, a quiet stream of sound in the vast silence of the room. It was the tune she often played when she felt lonely, a musical representation of her own quiet existence. Each note was a droplet of water, slowly carving a path through stone. Her eyes remained closed, her body still hunched slightly over the keys, but the terrible tension had begun to drain from her shoulders. The music was a warm blanket, a familiar comfort in a scary place. She was no longer on a stage in front of a class. She was back in her living room, the only audience the fading afternoon light. The students in the room started to relax a little. This was what they had expected, after all, a quiet, perhaps slightly nervous, performance from a quiet girl. It was nice, but it wasn't spectacular. The teacher watched, his head tilted, a thoughtful expression on his face. He could hear the technical correctness in her playing, the clean, precise touch. But he could also hear the hesitation, the fear still lingering at the edges of the melody. Then something changed. It was so subtle at first that almost no one noticed. A single note in the melody was held just a fraction of a second longer than expected. A chord was struck with a little more force than before. The quiet stream began to gather strength, its current quickening. Her posture, once curled and defensive, started to straighten. Her back straightened, her shoulders pulled back. Her left hand, which had been playing simple, supportive chords, began to move with more complexity and confidence. The sad melody was still there, but it was no longer just sad. It was developing a new layer, a sense of longing, of a question being asked. The music was growing, gaining a voice of its own. A few of the students who had been slouching in their seats began to lean forward, their curiosity piqued. This was more than they had bargained for. The transformation was not yet complete, but the foundation was laid. The girl at the piano was disappearing, and in her place an artist was emerging. The music was no longer just a memory she was replaying. It was a living, breathing thing that she was creating in that very moment. Her fingers, which had been so stiff and clumsy, now seemed to have a life of their own. They danced across the keys, no longer just pressing them down, but caressing them, coaxing the sound from the strings deep inside the piano's body. The quiet, lonely tune began to build in intensity, the notes becoming closer together, the harmonies richer and more complex. It was like watching a black and white picture slowly fill in with color. And then, the storm broke. Without warning, the gentle, flowing melody erupted. A cascade of thunderous, complex chords filled the room, so powerful and unexpected that several students physically flinched. The quiet girl was gone. In her place was a force of nature. Her hands flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. The music was no longer a sad story. It was a furious argument, a passionate plea, a roaring fire of sound. It was all the frustration she had ever felt, all the unspoken words, all the moments of feeling invisible, all channeled into a torrent of magnificent, breathtaking music. The sound didn't just fill the room. It seemed to expand it, pressing against the walls and the ceiling, vibrating through the floor and up into the solace of the spectators. The effect on the class was instantaneous and absolute. The boy in the corner with the trumpet, who had been looking bored, now sat bolt upright, his eyes wide with disbelief. The two girls who had been giggling with the cello were frozen, their mouths slightly agape, their forgotten instrument resting against their knees. Every single person in the room was captivated. They were no longer watching a classmate being put on the spot. They were witnessing a performance. The slouching was gone, the whispering had ceased, the doodling was forgotten. 30 pairs of eyes were locked on the girl at the piano, seeing her for the first time. The teacher stood motionless, his arms uncrossed and hanging loosely at his sides. The look of expectation on his face had been replaced by one of pure, unadulterated awe. He was a man who lived and breathed music, and he was hearing something truly special. He could hear the raw, untamed talent pouring from the piano, but more than that, he could hear the emotion. It was technically brilliant, but it was the soul behind the notes that was truly stunning. This was the lesson he had been trying to teach them. The lesson he had been unable to put into words, and here was this quiet, unknown girl. Showing them with her hands, the furious storm of music raged on. A whirlwind of sound that was both aggressive and beautiful. It was a contradiction, just like the girl herself. It was loud, yet it spoke of deep-seated silence. It was aggressive, yet it came from a place of profound vulnerability. Her entire body was now part of the performance. She swayed with the music, her head tilted back, her face a mask of intense concentration and emotion. A single tear escaped from her closed eye and traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, of finally letting the music out, and just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The thunderous chords faded away, leaving a moment of ringing silence. But she did not stop. From the quiet aftermath, a new melody began to emerge. It was the complete opposite of the fury that had come before. It was a hauntingly beautiful, delicate tune, so clear and pure, it sounded like a crystal bell ringing in a silent cathedral. This was the other side of the coin, the vulnerability that lay beneath the anger. It was the loneliness, the feeling of being an outsider, but it was no longer a weakness. It had been transformed into art. The melody was heartbreaking in its beauty, a story of quiet strength and deep, unspoken feelings. She was no longer just playing the piano. She was telling them her life story without saying a single word, and everyone in the room was listening with their entire heart. The final, delicate note hung in the air, a shimmering thread of sound that seemed to glow in the quiet room. It didn't just end. It dissolved, slowly fading into a silence that was more profound than any silence they had ever known. It was a heavy, sacred silence, full of the ghost of the music that had just filled every corner of the space. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire class was holding its breath, afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would be broken and they would wake up from a dream. The grand piano stood before her, no longer a monster, but a vessel that had just shared something incredible. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, her body still swaying slightly with the memory of the melody. Slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, her eyelids fluttered open. The world came back into focus, but it looked different. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling seemed softer. The faces of her classmates, which she had avoided for so long, were now clear and sharp. They were not looking at her with pity or amusement. They were looking at her with a kind of stunned reverence, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open. The realization of what she had just done, of the secret she had just revealed to the world, washed over her like a cold wave. A fresh wave of panic rose in her throat. She had been so exposed, so completely vulnerable. She had poured her entire soul into the music, and now everyone had seen it. Her hands began to tremble again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the aftermath of the emotion, the physical exhaustion of channeling so much feeling through her fingertips. She pulled her hands back from the keys and clutched them in her lap, her heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She waited for the laughter. She waited for the whispers. She waited for someone to say something that would shatter this fragile moment and put her back in her place as the quiet, invisible girl. The silence stretched on, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. It was the teacher who broke it. He had been standing by the piano, completely motionless, his face a canvas of pure awe. He slowly blinked, as if to make sure what he had just heard was real. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing right beside her. He didn't look at the class. He looked only at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and respect. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again, as if the words were too big to fit, and then the silence was shattered. It wasn't a polite, hesitant clap. It was an explosion. A boy in the back row, the one who was always slouching and looking bored, suddenly shot to his feet. "Whoa!" he yelled, the sound bursting out of him. It was like a starting pistol. In a split second, the entire class was on their feet. The room erupted in a thunder of applause and cheers. It was loud, chaotic, and completely genuine. They were not just clapping for a good performance. They were cheering for the girl they never knew, the quiet ghost who had just revealed herself to be a powerhouse. The girls with the cello were clapping so hard their hands were red. The boy with the trumpet was whistling through his fingers. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that washed over her. Chasing away the last of her fear, she sat there, stunned as the noise swirled around her. She looked out at the sea of faces, all turned towards her, all smiling, all cheering for her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, truly seen. And it wasn't scary, it was amazing. The teacher finally found his voice. He leaned down, his voice a low, amazed whisper that she could just hear over the noise. "My God," he said, shaking his head slowly in disbelief. "Where have you been hiding?" He didn't wait for an answer. He straightened up and turned to the class, raising his hands to quiet them down. All right, settle down," he said, but his voice was full of pride. "This," he announced, his voice booming through the room, "is what I have been talking about. This is not just playing notes. This is feeling. This is storytelling. This is music." The applause started up again, and the girl felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the lights. It was a feeling of pure, unadulterated joy. The secret she had guarded so fiercely, the part of herself she had been so afraid to share, had not been used against her. It had been celebrated. The wall she had built around herself for so many years, brick by brick, had just been torn down in a 5-minute performance. And the feeling of being free was more exhilarating than she had ever imagined. Slowly, she slid off the piano bench. Her legs felt a little shaky, but she stood up straight. She didn't hunch her shoulders or lower her head. She looked at her classmates, and for the first time, she didn't see them as a jury or a threat. She just saw them. She gave a small shy nod, a silent acknowledgement of their applause. The walk back to her chair was the complete opposite of the walk to the piano. This time, the students didn't just watch her passively. They made way for her, their eyes following her with a new kind of respect. A girl she had shared a chemistry class with for 2 years gave her a genuine, warm smile as she passed. Another boy gave her a thumbs up. She reached her chair in the back corner and sat down, but she didn't immediately pull out a book to hide behind. She just sat there, letting the sounds of the room wash over her. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. The spell was broken. Students started to gather their things, but the atmosphere was different. The usual frantic rush to get out the door was replaced by a more relaxed, buzzing energy. As she packed her own bag, a few students came up to her. "That was incredible," one girl said. "I had no idea." "Seriously, you were amazing," another boy added. She didn't know what to say, so she just smiled and mumbled a quiet, "Thank you." As she walked out of the music room and into the crowded hallway, she felt different. The sea of students didn't seem like a hurricane anymore. It was just a crowd. She held her head a little higher as she walked to her next class. She was still the same girl. She was still quiet, but she was no longer a ghost. She was the girl who played the piano, the girl who had stunned a room into silence and then brought it to its feet. The secret was out, and as she walked down the hall, a real, genuine smile spread across her face. It was a new beginning, and for the first time, she was excited to see what would happen next.